My stepmom tried to kick me out so her son could inherit my dad's house. I didn't think much of it when my stepmom sat me down the day after my dad's funeral and said, "We need to have a serious talk about your future in this house." But now I realize that was the moment everything started to spiral out of control. I guess I should give some context before I get into the full story. My mum passed away when I was 10, and for years it was just me and my dad. He was an amazing guy, kind, hardworking, and always made sure I knew I was loved. When I was around 15, he met my stepmom, Claire, and they got married a year later. Claire had a son, Ethan, who was about 6 years younger than me. At first, things were fine. Claire wasn't particularly warm or motherly toward me, but she wasn't outright mean either. Ethan was just a typical annoying kid. We coexisted, and I tried to make the best of it because I wanted my dad to be happy. Over the years, though, it became pretty clear that Claire was more invested in making sure Ethan got everything he wanted than in building any kind of bond with me. Fast forward to now. I'm 27 and was still living at home with my dad when he passed away suddenly from a heart attack. It was a shock to all of us. I had been living with him while finishing school and working a part-time job, and I'd also been helping him with the house, maintenance, yard work, all that stuff. It's the house I grew up in, so it's not just a place to me, it's home. The day of the funeral, Claire was acting strange. She kept giving me these pointed looks, and at one point she pulled me aside and said something like, "I hope you're ready to make some changes around here. Things aren't going to stay the same." At the time, I thought she was just overwhelmed with grief and maybe trying to assert some control in a situation where we all felt powerless. But now I think she was testing the waters to see how much resistance she'd face. The next day, she called me into the kitchen. Ethan was there too, sitting at the table with this smug little grin on his face. She started talking about how it didn't make sense for me to stay in the house anymore. "You're an adult," she said, "and it's time for you to move on and start your own life. Ethan and I need stability, and this house is big enough for us to build our future in." I was stunned. I literally couldn't speak for a few seconds because I didn't think she was serious. When I finally found my voice, I told her, "This is my dad's house. I'm not going anywhere." That's when she dropped the bomb. "Actually, the house belongs to the family now, and Ethan and I are just as much family as you are. We need it more than you do." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad had always been clear that the house was mine. He even talked to me about it a few weeks before he passed, saying how he wanted me to have a secure place to live and eventually raise my own family. I told Claire that, but she just shrugged and said, "Well, I don't know what kind of promises he made to you, but legally, this house belongs to all of us now." At this point, I was panicking. I called my dad's lawyer to figure out what was going on, and that's when I found out the truth. My dad had left the house to me entirely in his will. Not a split, not a shared inheritance, 100% mine. Claire wasn't happy about that, and apparently she'd already started contesting the will, claiming that my dad was under duress when he wrote it. I confronted her about it, and she didn't even try to deny it. She said she was doing what was best for her son, and that I was being selfish for not sharing. I told her this wasn't about sharing. It was about her trying to manipulate her way into something she wasn't entitled to. She got really defensive and started yelling about how I was disrespecting her as my stepmother and dishonoring my dad's memory. Ethan, meanwhile, just sat there smirking like this was all some big joke. At one point, he even said, "It's not like you need a house this big. You don't even have a family. What are you going to do with it?" I wanted to punch him. That's when Claire pulled out her trump card. She said, "If you don't leave willingly, I'll make sure you regret it. There's more than one way to win this." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but I could tell she wasn't bluffing. I started documenting everything, text messages, conversations, anything I thought might help me if this went to court. A week later, things escalated. I came home from work one evening to find Claire and Ethan going through my dad's things. They had boxed up some of his clothes and were talking about donating them to make space. I lost it. I told them they had no right to touch his stuff without my permission, and Claire just rolled her eyes and said, "We're the ones who are going to be living here. so it's only fair we start making it our own. That's when I realized she wasn't just trying to take the house, she was trying to erase my dad entirely. The worst part? I could feel myself starting to doubt my own rights. Claire was so confident, so sure of herself, that I started wondering if I really was being selfish. But then I'd remember my dad's voice, telling me how much he wanted me to have this house, and it would reignite my determination. At this point, I've hired a lawyer and am preparing for what I think will be a long, ugly battle. Claire has made it clear that she's not backing down, and I wouldn't be surprised if she's already looking for ways to sabotage me. Update. The day I came home to find the locks on my house changed, I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. I stood there on the porch, jiggling the keys over and over again, convinced I was losing my mind. But no, the locks had definitely been changed. And my stepmom? She was sitting inside the living room, calmly drinking tea like she hadn't just locked me out of my own home. I banged on the door, furious, and she finally came over to open it. She stood there in the doorway, completely unfazed, and said, "Oh, I thought I told you to let me know if you were coming back. You don't live here anymore." My blood was boiling. I told her very clearly that this was my house, legally mine, and that changing the locks was not only cruel, but also illegal. She shrugged and said, "Well, it doesn't feel like your house, it feels like mine now. And if you want to live here, you can talk to my lawyer." Then she slammed the door in my face. I wish I could say I handled this calmly, but I didn't. I completely lost it. I was yelling, calling her every name in the book, but she just ignored me. I could see Ethan standing behind her, laughing, like this was all some kind of joke. It was humiliating. I called the police, thinking there was no way they'd let her get away with this, but when they showed up, it was a different story. Apparently, because she was technically still married to my dad when he passed, she could argue that she had a right to live there, even though the will clearly stated the house belonged to me. The officers told me this was a civil matter and that I'd need to take it to court. So there I was, standing on the porch of my own house, while my stepmom and her son settled in like they owned the place. I had no choice but to leave. I went to stay with a friend for a few days while I figured out my next steps. I felt completely powerless and honestly a little scared. If she was willing to go this far, what else was she capable of? I started documenting everything, text messages, emails, anything I thought might help me in court. My lawyer told me I was doing the right thing, but warned me that this was going to be a long, drawn-out process. Contesting a will isn't easy, especially when the other party is willing to play dirty. And Claire, she was definitely playing dirty. A couple of days after the lock-changing incident, I got a notice in the mail. It was a formal letter from her lawyer claiming that the will was invalid because my dad was incapacitated when he wrote it. Claire was arguing that my dad had been pressured into leaving me the house and that she and Ethan were the rightful heirs. It was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. My dad was sharp as a tack right up until the day he passed. He was the one who had the idea to update his will in the first place because he wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any confusion about his wishes. But here's where things get even weirder. While going through some of my dad's old paperwork, I found a handwritten note he'd left in one of his desk drawers. It wasn't dated, but it was definitely his handwriting. It said, "If anything happens to me, trust no one except my lawyer." I stared at that note for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out what it meant. Had my dad known something was wrong? Was he worried about Claire? Or was it just a coincidence? I took the note to my lawyer, who said it might not hold up in court but could still be useful. It made me start thinking about all the strange things that had happened in the months leading up to my dad's death. For one, he'd been getting sick a lot more than usual. He was always healthy, but in the weeks before he passed, he kept complaining about feeling tired and weak. I assumed it was just stress or maybe his age catching up with him, but now I wasn't so sure. And then there was the way Claire had started acting toward him. She'd been unusually attentive, always making his meals, insisting he take his medications, and hovering over him like she was waiting for something. At the time, I thought she was just being a good wife, but now it felt off. One night, out of desperation, I decided to check the security cameras my dad had installed around the house. I hadn't even thought about them until that moment, but I realized they might have captured something useful. I logged into the system hoping to find footage of the day she changed the locks, but what I found was much more disturbing. About 2 weeks before my dad passed, there was footage of Claire going into his office late at night. She was carrying of something. I couldn't tell what and stayed in there for almost an hour. The next morning, there's footage of her leaving the house with the same box, looking nervous. I showed the footage to my lawyer, who said it was worth investigating, but without knowing what was in the box, it wasn't solid evidence. Then I remembered something else. A few days before my dad died, he'd told me he thought someone had been going through his stuff. He said a few documents in his office weren't where he'd left them, and he was worried about identity theft. I told him he was probably just being forgetful, but now I wasn't so sure. Things came to a head last week when Claire filed an emergency petition to have me removed from the property entirely. She claimed I was harassing her and Ethan, making threats and trying to intimidate them into leaving. None of it was true, but the judge granted her a temporary restraining order, which means I can't even go near the house until the court date. I feel like I'm living in some kind of soap opera. Every time I think things can't get worse, they do. I'm trying to stay strong, but it's hard. This house isn't just a piece of property to me. It's my home. It's where I grew up, where my dad raised me, and where I feel closest to him. The thought of losing it to someone like Claire makes me sick. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'm not giving up. My dad trusted me to protect his legacy, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure Claire doesn't get away with this. Final update. If you've been following my story, you know that my stepmom, Claire, has been doing everything in her power to take my dad's house from me. She's changed the locks, filed legal claims against my inheritance, and even accused me of harassment to get a restraining order. At this point, I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered next. It all started when my lawyer called me with a surprising update. He told me he had received a call from someone who claimed they had information about Claire that could help my case. At first, I thought it was a scam, but then the person emailed us a copy of a document, a second will my dad had written months before his death. It wasn't just a draft. It was signed and notarized. In this second will, my dad not only left the house to me, but also explicitly stated that Claire and her son were to receive nothing. I couldn't believe it. My dad must have known something was up, and this was his way of protecting me. The problem was, this will had never been filed with the lawyer, which meant it wasn't legally binding unless we could prove why my dad didn't file it. My lawyer told me this was a game changer, but we needed more evidence to back it up. That's when I decided to dig deeper into Claire's behavior leading up to my dad's death. I went back to the security footage from the cameras around the house. There was something about that box Claire had been carrying out of the house late at night that didn't sit right with me. I reviewed every clip I could find, and eventually, I struck gold. One night, about 3 weeks before my dad passed, the footage showed Claire sneaking into my dad's office again. This time, she was carrying a stack of papers. She stayed in the office for over an hour, rifling through drawers and eventually leaving with what looked like a folder. I couldn't see exactly what she took, but I had a sick feeling in my stomach. Could she have taken the second will? I showed the footage to my lawyer, and he suggested we get a subpoena to access any documents Claire might have in her possession. It was a long shot, but we needed to prove that she had tampered with my dad's affairs. Sure enough, when the court ordered her to hand over any documents related to the estate, one of the folders she turned in contained shredded pieces of what looked like a legal document. My lawyer had them analysed, and they matched the second will almost perfectly. But here's where things took an even darker turn. During the court proceedings, we started digging into Claire's financial history. What we found shocked me. A few months before my dad passed, Claire had taken out a massive life insurance policy on him, one she didn't tell anyone about. The policy named her as the sole beneficiary, and the payout was in the 7 figures. It was a huge red flag, and it made me question everything about my dad's death. I started remembering how my dad had been sick in the weeks before he died. He kept saying he felt off and that his medications weren't helping the way they used to. I decided to request a copy of his medical records, and that's when we uncovered something even more disturbing. In the weeks leading up to his death, my dad's prescriptions had been altered. Someone had switched out one of his heart medications for something that could worsen his condition instead of improving it. I don't think I need to spell it out, but I was horrified. My stepmom, the woman who claimed she was taking care of my dad, had access to his medications. And now, with the life insurance policy and her tampering with the will, it was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the house. This was about greed on a whole other level. My lawyer helped me file a formal complaint with the authorities. At this point, the case had gone beyond a civil dispute. It was turning into a criminal investigation. Claire must have realized the walls were closing in on her because she started acting desperate. She called me, crying and begging me to drop the case. She said, "I was just trying to protect Ethan. He's all I have." I told her that whatever she was trying to protect, it didn't justify what she did to my dad, or to me. The court ruled in my favor. Claire's claims against the will were thrown out, and the judge ordered her and Ethan to vacate the house immediately. But it didn't end there. The police opened an investigation into Claire's role in my dad's death, and as of now, she's facing charges for insurance fraud and possible manslaughter. I can't even put into words how surreal it feels to be in the middle of all this. It's like something out of a movie, but it's my life. I've moved back into the house, but it doesn't feel the same. Everywhere I look, I'm reminded of my dad and everything he went through in his final days. I feel guilty that I didn't see what was happening sooner, but I also know this isn't my fault. Claire fooled everyone, including my dad, and I'm just grateful that the truth finally came out. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can't take people at face value. Thanks for watching this video. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more these kinds of story videos.